for joining. Today our speaker is Chris Gough, who's an associate professor in biology at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he's going to talk to us today about disturbance at the threshold. When does tree mortality break the forest carbon cycle? So it's all yours, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Kate, and thanks for the invitation. So I want to acknowledge up front that this is really the work and ideas of several individuals, certainly not just myself, including one of your colleagues, Ben Bon-Lamberty, Alexei Shaklamanov as well, a postdoc at PNNL, and many others. So keep that in mind, please. And just a little bit more on who I am and where I am. I was telling Kate that much of what I do, and you'll hear about today, is actually work that's conducted up at the University of Michigan Biological Station, where I reside over the summer. I'm a plant physiological and ecosystem ecologist. I'm really, these days, mostly an experimentalist and not so much a modeler. Actually, I'll say not at all a modeler, but someone who works with some very talented modelers, including some of your colleagues at PNNL. I focus on carbon cycling in the upper Great Lakes. So much of what I'll discuss today and the results I'll describe come from our study site here. You can see in the graphic to the right, the map, the tip of the mitt, as we call it here in Michigan. So the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, which is really just nested right in the Great Lakes basin. My home institution is Virginia Commonwealth University, and it's a long, complicated story about why I still do work here. I was telling Kate a little bit about that. But essentially, this is my 16th summer, and so I'll go back in time a bit and describe some of our results over the last 10 years. And also just briefly, so I have a long history working with the DOE. What brought me here initially was, in fact, DOE-related work, which is ongoing. We are an Ameriflux core site. So briefly outline what will I talk about today. I'll talk briefly about the extent, source, and severity of forest disturbance. So particularly today, we'll focus on forest disturbance, really thinking about disturbance severity, which I'll define in a moment. I want to talk a little bit about how ecologists then and biogeochemists have traditionally viewed or thought about disturbance severity and carbon cycling interactions. Think about some early hypotheses and theories that have informed some of our work, and also have informed sort of how we pursue certain questions and experiments. And then 3, related to that, what do observations tell us about the reality of these hypothesized interactions between disturbance severity and carbon cycling? And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the knowledge gaps. I certainly will not, this won't be an exhaustive list, but give you some, at least really my perspective on what some of the knowledge gaps are, and then a very brief conclusion. And again, I want to acknowledge that this is really the work of a number of people, including students, many students. I'm up here at the University of Michigan Biological Station with, I think, 11 students and postdocs this summer combined. So large group, lots of collaborators and contributors. So a few terms and concepts. I know that most of you have a background in biogeochemistry, but because these are primarily ecological terms and I will use them repeatedly, I wanted to make sure I define them briefly. We're talking about net primary production, which is really the annual investment, carbon investment or carbon accumulation in plant biomass. Net ecosystem production, which is net primary production minus the heterotrophic respiration component. So that we often think of net ecosystem production as the net carbon balance, often frequently measured these days using flux towers. And then for the purpose of today's talk, when I discuss disturbance severity, this is really referencing the relative and sometimes the absolute amount of foliage or biomass lost to disturbance. So for example, the fraction of mortality that's associated with the disturbance tree mortality. So you'll see that in many cases, the x-axis when I'm presenting data will be disturbance severity, and the y-axis will be some measure of production, typically NEP or NPP. Okay, so again, now really launching into the material and thinking about what is the nature of disturbance historically, and then today. I think it's important to acknowledge that all forests are recipients of disturbance. As you'll see, the nature of disturbance, the kinds of disturbances that forests tend to be recipients of are changing. But certainly, when we look at the data, we'll see that for the most part, every forest, given the duration, the life of a forest, for the most part, every forest is disturbed at some point. Ecologists, going back in time, really thought about disturbance in the context, particularly when we think about disturbance severity, in the context of stand replacing disturbance. And much of this dates back to land clearing that occurred, depending on where you are in the US, 400 to 100 years ago or so, back in time. So in my area where I am now at the University of Michigan Biological Station, in fact, nearby we have the first sawmill in the Northwest Territory, which really largely supported this broad scale, widespread regional deforestation. And in fact, this is a picture I thought was kind of interesting, showing on the right there, that's Ernest Hemingway, who spent quite a bit of time up here about 20 miles away in a town called Petoskey. He's fishing, but you can see in the backdrop this deforestation, right? This devastated forest about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago in this case, in this area. And so that very rapidly transformed some of these mature, late successional, even old growth forests into early successional forests. And so this was, again, occurring 100 years ago, or in some cases much earlier, if we go to the East Coast. And you imagine, you look at an image like this, right, going back 100 years ago, it's not difficult to imagine that there are a number of ecological and biochemical changes that have occurred in response to this, again, stand replacing disturbance in which there's nearly 100% tree mortality, right? So this is really what ecologists spent a lot of time thinking about. They were surrounded by this, right, in a century ago and even more recently. And so this motivated much of disturbance ecology, and our understanding, really, what we pursued as biogeochemists and ecologists over the past 100 years or so. Certainly, that's still present on the landscape. This is a clear cut here locally, just a couple of miles away from where I am at the moment. So that's present, but as we'll see, right, this is a map produced not by me, but by Gough et al., showing the distribution of stand replacing mortality, essentially. So the dark purple would be lots of clear cutting, lots of stand replacement, in some cases fires, particularly in boreal systems. But what you'll notice in the upper Midwest, where I am, there's actually very little stand replacing disturbance. There certainly is some, but we're in a relatively low productivity region. There's not a lot of forest management, and there are very few forest fires. It's very, very wet, lots of precipitation, mesic region. And so there's not a lot of stand replacing disturbance in our region. And if you look, in fact, at the data, this is, we see this in the data. This is US wide from Cohn et al., using remote sensing, using Landsat data, looking at disturbance rates in the US over time, over the last few decades. And what we see is that there is this tendency for an increase in terms of percent distribution, or the percentage of forest disturbed annually. That's been on the rise, or increased rapidly in the 90s and has sort of stabilized in the early 2000s. But there was this increase, but much of that was in fact not due to harvesting, was not due to, again, clear-cut, stand replacing disturbances. And that's particularly true in our region, here in the upper Midwest. Another example of this is a natural example of this, of thinking of disturbances occurring along, starting to get us to think about disturbances occurring along a continuum rather than sort of binary clear-cut or severe fire, stand replacing, or healthy undisturbed forest. If we look at this map of tree mortality post-Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, we see that there's quite a range in mortality, tree mortality radiating from where Hurricane Katrina hit land, right? So not surprisingly, there's a concentration of mortality close to land where the hurricane center hit and the winds were greatest, and radiating from that center, we see much less tree mortality. So So really the point is disturbance occurs along a continuum of severity. That's true in nature, but it's also increasingly true because in certain regions, because of the nature of changing disturbance regime in certain regions, certain areas, and certainly in the upper Midwest. So in our area, in my area, in the upper Midwest, what we're seeing instead are disturbances that are not stand replacing and are more moderate with respect to severity. So what that means is there's some tree mortality, but rarely is it 100%. So examples of that might be emerald ash borer, which is really decimated all the ash trees here, particularly in Michigan, in fact, and increasingly in the Mid-Atlantic as well. It's been marching its way down through the Mid-Atlantic. Beech bark disease as well is very prevalent on the left here. That's on the left of the screen in that image. That's a beech tree that has beech bark disease. Beech are declining very rapidly in this region. But again, that's not 100% mortality. This is one species among several in this forest. Windthrow. So getting away from pests and insects, from pests and pathogens rather, for a moment, thinking of extreme weather events and windthrow, which in this case snapped several stems but did not result in 100% mortality. Fire, when it does occur in the upper Midwest, tends not to be high severity, stand replacing. This was actually a fairly high severity disturbance, resulted in quite a bit of mortality, but you can see much of the subcanopy survived or proliferated following this crown scorching fire here in the upper Midwest. Hemlock woolly adelgid, another example, right? So there's several examples then of disturbance that we can think of that operate within this sort of moderate realm of disturbance severity. And I think that's important to note and understand. So part one summary then, I think a few take homes here. One is that disturbance is increasing in extent, or it was in the late 90s and appears to maybe have leveled. But with that change or increase in disturbance extent, we're seeing a change in disturbance regime. Generally speaking, in many regions, there's a decline in severe stand replacing disturbance, and in many cases, an increase in moderate severity disturbances. And it's important to note that this results in substantial variation across forested landscapes in disturbance severity. Again, it's not so much binary, it's a continuum of disturbance severity within forested landscapes. And apologies, I tried to turn off my my email notices, but appeared not to be successful, so you may hear that occasionally. Okay, getting to the second section of the webinar today, I want to think a little bit more then about how ecologists and biogeochemists have viewed disturbance severity carbon cycling interactions. And going back in time, and really even up to the current, the present time, often we think of disturbance as having a being disruptive. And in this case from Google, right, according to Google, disturbance is the disruption of healthy functioning. We could, in our case for the discussion today, think of the disruption of healthy carbon cycling, right, or production of a forest. And in fact, that's this sort of general definition of disturbance mapped on quite well to how ecologists have thought about disturbance and its effects on the carbon cycle. And this dates back to the 60s and 70s and some really important papers, which were really useful as an initial template for how we think of disturbance carbon cycling interactions and the theoretical underpinnings. And I won't get into a lot of depth here, but just to say that in the 60s, in the 70s, they didn't have flux towers. They didn't really have they certainly didn't have the methodology that we have today to test those hypotheses. And so really the default 40, 50 years ago was this idea that disturbance severity would, as we increase along on the x-axis, this is a conceptual illustration of the really the defaults or sort of null hypothesis at the time, which is that as disturbance severity increases, there would be an incremental or sort of one-to-one relationship, right, between increasing disturbance severity, tree mortality, for example, and declining net ecosystem production or net primary production. This would be a linear relationship. And so, for example, a 40% tree mortality disturbance event, would result in a commensurate decline in net ecosystem or primary production. And in fact, this has been observed in grasslands. And so this is one of 3 potential short-term responses to disturbance severity, and one that was really assumed to be, the null response or the assumed response. More recently, though, when we look at aquatic ecosystems, it turns out that some ecosystems may have a nonlinear response, in which, in this case, there's a high sensitivity to increasing disturbance severity. So just a little bit of disturbance results in a precipitous decline in net ecosystem or net primary production. And then, even more recently, modeling work from Dietz and Mattis showed in 2014, not that long ago, that there may be a nonlinear response in which there's, in fact, high resistance initially. So there's a tendency for resistance to increasing disturbance, in which net ecosystem and net primary production is sustained as we move along this disturbance severity continuum until we reach a threshold or a break point beyond which there's this precipitous decline in production. So there are multiple outcomes. A few years ago, we didn't have really a good handle on what the possibilities were, at least with respect to observations in the field. And so we decided we would tackle that question, and I'll talk about that next. But to summarize what we just talked about, ecologists, again, have generally assumed a one-to-one linear relationship between tree mortality or disturbance severity and net primary and ecosystem production decline. So a linear relationship has been assumed and in some cases observed. And some modeling and observational data from other ecosystems, however, suggest other relationships are possible in forests. So that brings us to our next section, and this is where I'll present some results that lead us up to a study that was just launched, in fact, with Ben Bon-Lamberty as a co-lead PI. But I want to go back in time briefly and talk about a long-term experiment that's been underway here at the University of Michigan Biological Station that really uses an experimental approach, or several experiments, in fact, to study disturbance severity at the ecosystem scale and understand the carbon cycling responses and start to think about the mechanistic underpinnings of this relationship between disturbance severity and carbon cycling. So, as I mentioned before, we have here at the University of Michigan Biological Station Clearcuts in the area. Many of these are actually experimental Clearcuts, meaning they were executed systematically over several decades. And we've also done some experimental partial defoliation studies, which I'll talk about. So we have across this landscape here at the biological station a gradient of disturbance severities that are, for the most part, tightly controlled, or at least more tightly controlled than they would be if they were just opportunistic observational studies. So again, what we're after here is really a test of which one of these relationships, this linear, or again, looking at these 2 nonlinear possibilities, which one of these occurs in this upper Midwest landscape. So if we go to the University of Michigan Biological Station landscape, which is comprised of 10,000 acres of forest land, can't really tell from this perspective, but there's a lot of variability in the degree, the extent of disturbance severity. Some of that, again, is experimental, and some of that is due to natural disturbance. As I'm presenting this section, the green will be areas that are low disturbance severity, the orange will be moderate disturbance severity, and the red will be high or severe levels of disturbance severity, right? So the green here, this area is the long-term 20-year Ameriflux site. For those of you who are familiar with Ameriflux, this would be the US UMB site so operating since 98, 99. And this is considered a low disturbance severity area, not a lot of disturbance severity. And so we have some understanding from this long-term record what the baseline NEP and NPP, NEP really from the Flux Tower, what those data, what those rates, fluxes look like, again, in this area that's been minimally disturbed over time. But again, we want a gradient, right? We want to understand, we want to elongate this gradient of disturbance severity and really get at what's this relationship between severity and production. And so we did that several years ago by looking at recently, well, in some cases recently, in some cases quite distantly, back in time, experimentally clear cut, harvested and burned sites, which we call the burn plots here at the University of Michigan Biological Station. And so what's somewhat unique about these sites is they were experimental. It's an experimental chronosequence. So dating back to the 30s, the same experimental high severity manipulation has been applied periodically about every 20 years to the landscape. And so there was actually a recent experimental cut and burn, clear cut and burn in 2018. It gives you an idea of what that looks like. It's a controlled burn, and so some fire. And again, really trying to manipulate the site, really impose the disturbance that occurred more broadly in the region over 100 years ago now. So if we look at the data from the low disturbance and the high disturbance severity sites and look at these sort of two ends of the continuum, right? Low to high disturbance severity. This is looking at net ecosystem production. The green, again, is low disturbance severity. The red, high disturbance severity. Not surprisingly, harvest and fire much reduces net ecosystem production, which is on the y-axis. And there's some recovery over time. So that's what the left figure on the left is showing. But really, for our interest today, we're interested in seeing where those points map on to this disturbance severity continuum on the right. And so these two extremes allow us to set, again, our high and low values on this continuum of disturbance severity. So this was published a while back. We thought about this over a decade ago now. And then we went back to this landscape and we thought, well, what can we use? What would be interesting and useful to fill in that middle area of moderate disturbance severity? And in fact, there's more in the past few years because of some of those moderate disturbances that I showed you in some of the images earlier, insect pests in particular, pathogens. But at the time, there really wasn't anything on the landscape that was obvious. So what we decided to do was implement a large-scale experiment of moderate disturbance severity. The orange shaded area that you see there, again, represents this area of moderate severity disturbance that was manipulated, as I'll show you in a moment. And there's another Flux Tower that was installed in 2007. It's been operating since, and that's, in fact, again, for you, those of you who know the Ameriflux core sites or familiar with those sites, that's USUMD, so D being disturbed. And what we did in 2008 was to implement this moderate severity disturbance across a 39 hectare, so about 100-acre area within the Flux Tower footprint. We stem girdled 7,000 aspen and birch trees, mature canopy trees, and you can see what that looks like here. There are there's a Sawyer scoring trees on the left and cutting in two places. And what we did then on the right was we came through with pry bars, peeled off the bark. And what that does is it severs the phloem. And by severing the phloem, what we're doing is we're cutting off the transport of sugars from the crown down to the roots, and the trees die. Usually when I'm presenting this to ecologists, I wait for a collective gasp. I'm not sure with this webinar that I can even hear the collective gasp, but we did this, again, really intentionally to control. Not in this case, we were interested in really accelerating succession, removing or eliminating the early successional aspen and birch trees And as you'll see, we learned a great deal. We were surprised by our findings. So this is in fact from a more recent study that I'll describe briefly in a moment, but it gives you some sense for what that looks like at the ecosystem scale. You can see all these girdles around the trees. This again sets in motion this senescence of these stem girdled trees, which plays out over time. Typically, for the aspen and birch, we see complete mortality. After about 2 years, certainly after 4 years, everything is dead. All trees are dead. And you can see both from above, the image at the top, and below, under the canopy, looking up, the image on the right, that the structure of the canopy has been modified. And it looks, again, like a moderate severity disturbance, not like a stand replacing high severity disturbance. From the air, you can see sort of these gray areas, the patchy landscape, the mosaic of mortality across this landscape, which is patchy, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But there's a fair amount of mortality across the landscape, but again, nothing that approaches the level of complete stand replacing disturbance. All right, so to our results, on the x-axis we have the year, and on the y-axis at the top we have leaf area index, top figure panel. The bottom is net ecosystem production. And what we see during the trough, so again, in this case, we have a control site, which is the long running low disturbance severity control US UMB site, and the moderately disturbed US UMD site in the orange, illustrated here in orange. What we see is that during this peak period of disturbance in 2010, there is in fact a decline in leaf area index, which makes sense. So the amount of leaves and the amount of foliage has been eroded in response to this experimental disturbance by about 40%. Again, we would expect to see that. We would hope to see that when we were implementing a disturbance that has killed about 40% of the trees. But what was interesting and surprising was that we did not see a corresponding decline in net ecosystem production. And you can see below the bottom panel that, again, despite this 40% reduction in the number of leaves, we did not see a corresponding decline in net ecosystem production. This was surprising to us. This was, in fact, not our hypothesis. And so, again, where then that would map onto this conceptual diagram is here on this top nonlinear line relationship showing or suggesting really high resistance to disturbance, at least through 40% LAI reduction, right? So that places us on the right. This portion of the curve supports this nonlinear sort of threshold relationship between net ecosystem production and disturbance severity. So we thought we would pursue this a bit more. We went to this landscape, which again I mentioned is if we look within the landscape, which again was 39 hectares or about 100 acres of manipulated landscape, there's quite a bit of variability in tree mortality. This is associated just with variability in the distribution of aspen and birch within that landscape. So recall that we only stem girdled aspen and birch trees. And so with that variability in the distribution of those species, we see variability in mortality. So we went to the landscape, we thought about, all right, well, where are plots with low tree mortality and where are plots with high tree mortality? And can we elongate that disturbance severity continuum and get a better handle on, again, this relationship between disturbance severity and NEP? Because we really only had one point when viewing this from sort of the landscape perspective and comparing the Flux Tower data with the landscape level assessment of mortality. So this is a student of mine's MS thesis turned publication, Ellen Stewart-Enkins. And in fact, yes, what she found was support for this idea that within the landscape, and this is looking at the y-axis is a little bit complicated, but think of this as the change in net primary production on the y-axis, and then the x-axis again being a measure of disturbance severity. And she found support for this idea that there's a nonlinear threshold relationship, in this case between net primary production and disturbance severity. And in fact, in this case, we observed a break point or a transition point around 60%. So 60% mortality was required before there was a transition or a loss, in a sense, of stability in net primary production post-disturbance. You can see that transition point and precipitous decline on the far right of the figure. So that was interesting. That was surprising. And in fact, this fueled some additional research that I'll talk about here in a moment. So there's again, if we map on the data from Ellen's thesis and publication, we find that there's support from both publications, both studies, suggesting this nonlinear relationship, at least in our study system, between disturbance severity and forest production. So the question is why, and I will say that 10 years ago, because this wasn't our expectation, we weren't necessarily readily equipped to pursue the mechanism. And again, that's really set up some work that's ongoing that I'll talk about briefly in a moment. But I'll tell you what we know and what we were able to determine. And this is again from Ellen Stewart-Enkin's work. What we found was that this erosion of the upper canopy leaf area, this top figure, panel A, as a function of increasing disturbance severity on the x-axis, results in increasing canopy openness. Not surprising, right? So decreasing leaf area in the upper canopy results in more openness. And then what results is this change or this redistribution of growth limiting resources. So in this case, the subcanopy plants, vegetation, receive much more light. Again, not surprising. So we saw this increase in light availability and also light absorbed by the subcanopy vegetation, which resulted in a whole suite of changes in subcanopy vegetation physiology and biochemistry. So we see an increase as canopy openness increases as a function of increasing disturbance severity in percent nitrogen, in A max, which is essentially the physiological competency of an individual leaf with respect to photosynthesis, and then leaf mass per area, which is this increase, at least in red maple, is telling us that leaves are becoming more sun acclimated as disturbance severity increases and as canopy openness increases. So essentially what we think happens, but again, we started looking at this a couple of years really after disturbance severity, not knowing, after we implemented the disturbance, I should say, not knowing that we would see this high resistance to disturbance, increasing disturbance severity. But what we think occurred was a rapid compensatory response. In other words, a very rapid redistribution of resources, particularly to sub-canopy vegetation, which resulted in physiological and biochemical changes and rapid compensatory growth by subcanopy vegetation, enough so that there was an offset of the mortality in the upper canopy up to that 60% threshold. Something we're pursuing now, and this is a bit more of a working hypothesis than necessarily a conclusion that we can draw from prior observations, but we also have been thinking about how disturbance and disturbance severities reshape the structure of an ecosystem, the physical structure and the biological structure, the diversity, for example, of an ecosystem. So what we're finding, what we think we may be seeing, is that moderate severity disturbances maybe counterintuitively increase how efficiently resources are used. So contrast that with severe disturbances, which disrupt the system to such an extent that essentially resources are not used very efficiently at all. And so this drives down the complexity of the system. In this case, this very severely disturbed forest becomes much simpler biologically, much structurally much simpler structurally. And this, we think, drives down the efficiency by which resources are used to promote growth. So light use efficiency, nitrogen use efficiency decline. But on the spectrum of moderate severity disturbance, we think in some cases, we are observing increases in biological complexity and an increase in structural complexity. There's a more uneven aged distribution of vegetation across landscapes. And in some cases, that uneven aged, multi-aged distribution appears to result in more efficient resource use and in fact, higher production. Again, somewhat counterintuitive, because in this case, we're suggesting that this introduction of disturbance actually stimulates production. What's interesting, and I'm not going to touch on modeling much today, but this is work led by Ben Bon-Lamberty, again, your colleague, that looked at the observed response from this experiment that I just presented. So in this case, the treatment versus the control is the solid line at the top with the filled circles. Compared that to a suite of models, and none of the models essentially were able to simulate the observed resistance to disturbance. And again, maybe not surprisingly, even as ecologists, we were not expecting this, right? So our models are certainly parameterized and formulated based on our ecological understanding of the system, and this is relatively new information. So maybe isn't surprising that the models failed to simulate this observed resistance. So part 3 summary, again, net primary production and ecosystem production may, against expectations, our expectations anyway, at the time, resist moderate severity disturbances. Some ecosystems appear to be quite resistant to moderate levels of disturbance severity. And this may, again, be because of compensatory mechanisms that help to offset declining growth from the trees that are senescing. And models, at least the models that we've tested, fail to simulate this observed resistance. There you can see Ben Bon-Lamberty on the right. So we'll launch then into what don't we know? What are the knowledge gaps and how do we fill them? This is brief, but I do want to say that without getting political here, that it is interesting to think about, again, where are models failing, and why are they failing, right? And how can ecologists help support model improvement, right? And so that's the work that Ben and I have been collaborating on, really, in this next iteration of trying to understand how disturbance severity, again, affects the mechanisms that affect and support resilience, and being able to then understand whether we can integrate that information, or at least use that information to inform an advance in modeling disturbance, the response of disturbance. So data and models, in other words, need each other, right? So I'll just present a few knowledge gaps as I see them, and this would also be an interesting point of discussion later. Certainly would be interested in hearing your thoughts. One knowledge gap is what pre-disturbance canopy structures confer carbon cycling stability, and how should this be represented in models? So in other words, we think, and again, I alluded to this before, but we think that structure, the physical structure and the biological structure prior to disturbance in some cases, may be important to predicting the degree of stability following a disturbance, right? But at this point, we don't really know what the useful structural indicators are. What indicators or what structural features would be proxies for stability, good predictors of stability, and we don't understand the mechanisms as well that would couple this pre-structural configuration to stability. So all of that, we need to work out as ecologists before we can begin informing models. That's a part of an experiment that Ben and I are currently working on here at the University of Michigan Biological Station. One of the ways we characterize structure increasingly is using LiDAR-based approaches, right? So rather than thinking of conventional measures of community structure or diversity, we can now map the physical structure of forests in very sophisticated ways, and of course in ways that are way more computationally intensive than we could, in fact, necessarily incorporate into, say, an Earth system model. But as ecologists, this type of information, physical information, provides a great deal of information and allows us to understand perhaps the mechanisms that underlie, again, these changes or not in production following disturbance. Knowledge gap 2 is I think, thinking a bit about how different types of disturbances within this realm of moderate severity disturbance might affect the carbon cycle. So even within this bin of moderate severity disturbance, there's a great deal of variability in how those disturbances reshuffle structure and therefore may affect the carbon cycle. So for example, the top panel here, it's a little bit complicated, but what we're looking at is a hit grid, a LiDAR-based hit grid of vegetation before on the left and following on the right, an ice storm experiment at Hubbard Brook Forest, in which there was an application, in fact, of ice. And what we see is that ice damage shifted vegetation downward in the canopy. But if we go to the Great Smoky Mountains, another moderate severity disturbance, but in this case fire, the LAI, the leaf area or vegetation area distribution was the change in LAI or VAI was more evenly distributed across that vertical axis. In other words, whereas the ice damage appeared to shift the LAI downward, we instead in the Great Smoky Mountains, we tend to see this more even compression or decline in LAI across that vertical axis, right? And so that could have implications for the carbon cycle because the redistribution of resources and vegetation differs between these two disturbances, even though they're within the same sort of range of disturbance severity. This is a experiment that was just launched this past week at the University of Michigan Biological Station with Bob Fahey and Danielle Tanzer from UConn leading. And what Bob's doing is he's using a power washer, in fact, to literally blow away leaves and in some cases poke holes in leaves, as you can see there on the right. And what he's doing is he and they are simulating, in a sense, herbivory. So ecologists are having to think about creative ways to implement these large-scale experiments, and at least the preliminary data suggests that this was quite successful. A long day's work, it appears, resulted in a 30% decline in LAI using this power washer. So fairly successful, at least from the preliminary data. Again, a project that I've been alluding to with Ben von Lamberty is NSF supported, National Science Foundation supported, and we call the Forest Resilience Threshold Experiment, or FORTE. This experiment is really trying to get at, in a very controlled way, where and what are the carbon cycling tipping points. So recall in the prior experiment that I described earlier, the results I described earlier, we weren't really intentionally manipulating disturbance severity. We took advantage of the disturbance severity within the landscape, but again, that was really a function of where the aspen and the birch, which we stem girdled, were, how they were distributed, where they were, and what the density was within the landscape. In this case, what we're doing is we're very deliberately and intentionally targeting disturbance severity levels across the landscape here at the University of Michigan Biological Station. And this is really exciting and of interest to us. We looked last year in 2018, July 2018, these green dots, kind of hard to see there on the left, but those are plot centers. This is pre-disturbance implementation. What we see, we implemented the experiment in May, so just about a month and a half ago, almost 2 months ago now. And we can already see from false color infrared imagery from space. On the right image there, July 2019, an erosion of LAI in the canopy. You can see that in the imagery. And so this experiment has a very strong field modeling coupling component, iterative component, in which the field data inform the model and the model parameterization. In this case, we're using primarily ED2. And the results of ED then feed back, and the sensitivity of ED and the limitations in the ED parameterization feedback to inform our data collection. So this is just showing some students in the field, but Ben and I got together, and certainly as an ecologist, I recognize that we have sort of our favorite parameters that we like to chase and pursue in the field. But when we're thinking about modeling trying to simulate these responses to disturbance, in some cases there's a mismatch between our data collection in the field and what the models require to simulate these disturbance responses. And so that's part of what we're really trying to do, we hope, well, through this integration at the beginning of modeling and field data collection and parameterization. So this is just showing you again this relationship and this sort of iterative relationship between field measurements, data that we're collecting, students are collecting. In fact, right now as I'm speaking in the field here, using those data to spin up and form and parameterize ED2. And in fact, Alexi already has some data that's sounds like will be helpful to us as in the field, on the ground ecologists, thinking about how we might reallocate our effort next summer a bit and collect data where there may be an opportunity to improve model simulations. And so in closing, I want to leave a few minutes for questions. This is my last slide. Probably there's a lot more I could say here, but I will. What I would like to conclude with is just say that I think we should acknowledge that there's a great deal of disturbance across forested landscapes, and increasingly that's not the flashy high disturbance severity disturbance that we're maybe accustomed to as ecologists, or that we necessarily see visually, or we're used to thinking of, both in terms of how we do our science, where we place our effort, and that these moderate severity disturbances, in fact, may be quite important ecologically, but we know little about them. And so understanding why some forests resist the effects of disturbance, and when this disturbance appears to break down, this resistance appears to break down, is increasingly important. We now know that there are nonlinearities in the system that we didn't expect. The mechanisms that, again, might support resistance are still a bit fuzzy, and so that's a major priority of this ongoing experiment with Ben Lamberty and Alexi and others. And then lastly, again, with this in mind, we need to resolve the mechanisms that should be incorporated into models to simulate observed responses to disturbance. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm also happy to answer questions offline via email.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to stop the recording.
Sure.